October 23, 1942. The vast expanse of the North African desert stretched before Field Marshal Erwin Rommel as he observed American Sherman tanks through his binoculars from atop a sand dune near El Alamein. "These Americans are nothing but soft Italians with better equipment," he remarked confidently to General Wilhelm von Thoma, certain that German tactical superiority would overcome any material advantage the new Allied force might possess. Little did the Desert Fox know that within 5 months, his Africa Corps would lose over 500 tanks to an industrial juggernaut he had fatally underestimated. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how one of history's greatest military commanders learned the harsh lesson that in modern warfare, production capacity often trumps tactical brilliance and battlefield courage. The North African campaign of 1942 to 1943 represented a crucial turning point in World War II, where German military doctrine collided with American industrial might. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had built his reputation on brilliant maneuvers and tactical innovation, dominating the North African theater against British forces since his arrival in February 1941. Leading the vaunted Africa Corps, Rommel had become something of a legend even among his enemies, known for his aggressive tank tactics and ability to achieve victories despite being outnumbered. Rommel's reputation had grown to mythic proportions after his successes against the British Eighth Army. With just 2 German divisions and supporting Italian units, he had repeatedly outmaneuvered numerically superior British forces. His tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and concentrated armor thrusts at weak points in enemy lines. The British came to respect and fear his abilities, with Prime Minister Winston Churchill referring to him in a speech to Parliament as a very daring and skillful opponent, a great general. Even Allied soldiers developed a strong, begrudging admiration for the Desert Fox, with many believing that the opposing side had the better commander. The introduction of American forces to the theater in late 1942 was about to change the strategic balance in ways that tactical brilliance alone could not overcome. What Rommel failed to grasp was that he was about to face not just another military opponent, but the full weight of American industrial capacity, a force that would transform the battlefield in North Africa and eventually all of Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Otto Behrendt, Rommel's intelligence officer, compiled detailed reports on the arriving American forces in 1942. "Their equipment is impressive, but their soldiers lack combat experience," he noted in his official assessment. "Many are factory workers and farmers who have never seen battle. Our veterans will make short work of them." This sentiment was shared throughout the upper echelons of the Africa Corps, where battle-hardened officers had fought across Europe and Africa for 3 years. The Americans, by contrast, were newcomers to the theater, untested and unproven. Captain Werner Kortenhaus of the 15th Panzer Division recalled in his diary, "The field marshal gathered us for a briefing today. He spoke of the Americans with a dismissive tone I had never heard him use when discussing the British. 'They are soft like the Italians,' he said, 'but their tanks will break down in our desert just the same. Their crews lack the discipline and determination of German soldiers.' We all nodded in agreement, failing to recognize the storm that was about to engulf us. The Germans had reason for confidence. The Africa Corps had outfought numerically superior British forces. German tanks like the Panzer IV were technically superior to early American Shermans in terms of firepower, and German crews were vastly more experienced. What Rommel and his command failed to appreciate, however, was the sheer scale of American industrial capacity that was about to transform the battlefield. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the U.S. II Corps, brought with him not just men and machines, but the output of the most powerful industrial base in the world. American factories were producing tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ammunition at a rate that dwarfed German production. In 1942 alone, the United States manufactured 24,997 tanks compared to Germany's 4,137. This 6-to-1 production advantage was just beginning to make itself felt on the battlefields of North Africa. The scale of American industrial mobilization was unprecedented in world history. By the end of 1942, American factories were producing a new tank every 30 minutes, a new aircraft every 5 minutes, and a new ship almost daily. Detroit's automobile plants had been converted to tank production with astonishing speed and efficiency. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Michigan could produce more tanks in a month than all of Germany's factories combined. Ford's massive Willow Run plant was assembling a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes on a mile-long assembly line, an industrial feat the Germans considered technically impossible until they saw captured footage of the facility in operation. This industrial might allowed American forces to operate with a fundamentally different approach to equipment. While German units had to carefully husband their resources, knowing replacements were scarce, American commanders could afford to be more aggressive, accepting losses as an inevitable cost of gaining combat experience. "We can afford to trade material for time and experience," General George S. Patton would later note. The Germans cannot. Sergeant James Warrington of the U.S. 1st Armored Division remembered his first encounter with Afrika Korps veterans in December 1942. "They looked at our equipment with a mix of envy and disdain." One German POW, a tank commander, told me through a translator that our Sherman was a coffin for 5 men, but then asked if he could keep a pack of our cigarettes. That told me everything I needed to know about the state of their supply lines. The disparity in logistics was staggering. While American troops received 4,500 calories daily with regular cigarette and chocolate rations, German soldiers in North Africa were subsisting on 1,500 calories or less. American tankers had access to spare parts, tools, and maintenance support that German crews could only dream of. For every tank the Germans lost, replacing it required a torturous supply line across the Mediterranean, where Allied air and naval power took an ever-increasing toll. The logistical difference extended to every aspect of military operations. American units had dedicated supply companies with fleets of standardized trucks, while German forces relied on a hodgepodge of captured vehicles that were difficult to maintain due to parts incompatibility. American forces had mobile field hospitals with penicillin, plasma, and advanced surgical capabilities. German medical units were chronically short of even basic supplies like bandages and antiseptics. American commanders could call on vast reserves of fuel, allowing tanks to operate at full capacity. German vehicles were often limited to just a few kilometers of movement per day to conserve precious fuel. The Red Ball Express, an American supply system that would later become famous in Europe, had its beginnings in North Africa, where quartermaster units developed techniques for rapid resupply that could keep pace with fast-moving armored columns. Supply trucks would race forward with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts as soon as objectives were secured, allowing American forces to maintain momentum that the Germans couldn't match. Colonel Thomas J. Nixon of the Quartermaster Corps later wrote, "In North Africa, we learned that logistics determines not just whether you can fight, but how you fight." The Germans were forced to plan around their limitations. We could plan around our capabilities. While German soldiers went weeks without mail from home, American units had dedicated postal services that delivered letters and packages even to frontline positions. This might seem a minor point, but psychological studies conducted by the U.S. Army showed that regular contact with home significantly improved morale and combat effectiveness. It was another small but significant advantage that accumulated alongside material superiority. Colonel Albin Erzik, commanding a tank battalion in the 1st Armored Division, noted the psychological impact of American material superiority. "We lost tanks, sure, but replacement vehicles and parts arrived within days. The Germans would knock out one of our Shermans, and we'd have 2 more in its place by the next engagement." You could see it in the faces of the German POWs. The dawning realization that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial continent. The first major test came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where Rommel's forces initially battered the inexperienced American units. The Germans poured through the pass, pushing back American forces and capturing equipment and prisoners. It seemed that Rommel's assessment had been correct. The battle began on February 14, 1943, when elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck American positions at Sidi Bouzid. Lacking coordination between armor and infantry, and with poor tactical positioning, the American defenders were quickly overwhelmed. By February 19th, German forces had advanced nearly 50 miles into Allied territory, inflicting over 6,000 casualties and capturing or destroying 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, and 208 artillery pieces. Sergeant Frank Towers of the 1st Armored Division described the chaos of those initial engagements. "We had trained for months in the States, but nothing prepared us for facing Rommel's veterans. They attacked from unexpected directions, coordinated their tanks and infantry perfectly, and seemed to anticipate our every move. We were scattered, disorganized, and frankly, outclassed. It was a harsh lesson in what real combat against elite forces was like." For German officers, the initial success at Kasserine seemed to confirm their low opinion of American fighting capabilities. Captain Franz Kesternick of the 15th Panzer Division wrote in a letter home, "The Americans flee at the first sign of our panzers. They abandon perfectly good equipment without disabling it. They have much to learn about war, and I doubt they have the stomach for it." The field marshal was right. They are soft, despite their impressive machines. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, who was captured during the battle, later wrote, "Rommel personally interrogated several of us senior officers. He was dismissive, almost contemptuous, asking how America thought it could defeat veteran German forces with factory workers in uniforms. His confidence was absolute, even as we could see his own troops were threadbare and exhausted despite their victory." But the battle at Kasserine Pass would prove to be Rommel's last victory in North Africa, and even this success revealed troubling signs for the Germans. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Americans quickly regrouped, learned from their mistakes, and returned to the battlefield with reinforcements. What most alarmed German observers was how quickly American units adapted their tactics and how many fresh tanks and vehicles they could field despite their losses. The American ability to absorb the lessons of defeat proved remarkable. Within days of the Kasserine setback, sweeping changes were implemented throughout American forces in Tunisia. General Eisenhower removed Fredendall, whose poor leadership had contributed to the defeat, and eventually replaced him with the aggressive and tactically astute General George S. Patton. Training programs were immediately established behind the lines where units could practice coordinated infantry tank operations modeled on German techniques. Artillery was repositioned to provide better fire support, and air-ground coordination was overhauled. Most impressively, the material losses were replaced with astonishing speed. Within 2 weeks of the battle, the U.S. 1st Armored Division had received 100 new tanks to replace those lost in the fighting. The 1st Infantry Division, which had lost significant quantities of artillery, had been fully re-equipped with new guns and ammunition. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and other vehicles arrived daily from Algerian ports, where Liberty ships disgorged their cargoes around the clock. British General Harold Alexander, who observed this rapid recovery, later commented, "The Americans treated defeat as a learning opportunity. They studied what went wrong, fixed it, and came back stronger." Their ability to replace material losses overnight gave them the confidence to experiment and adapt without fear of catastrophic failure. It was a luxury we British never had. Major Karl-Heinz Becker of the 10th Panzer Division wrote in a field report, "We destroyed at least 40 American tanks in the recent engagement, yet when we encountered them again 3 days later, they appeared to have more tanks than before. Their maintenance crews worked through the night to repair damaged vehicles, while we must abandon ours for lack of spare parts. It is a mathematics problem that does not favor us." General George von Bismarck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, noted a shift in Rommel's demeanor after Kasserine. The field marshal no longer speaks of American softness. He has seen their industrial might firsthand now, watching them replace in days what would take us months. He grows increasingly concerned about fuel and ammunition shortages while the Americans seem to have endless supplies of both. Indeed, the logistical situation for the Afrika Korps was becoming dire. By March 1943, German tanks were limited to just a few kilometers of movement per day due to fuel shortages. American and British aircraft dominated the skies, making daylight movement hazardous. American forces were receiving not only replacement tanks, but improved versions with much better armor and more powerful guns. The stark reality of the production disparity became impossible to ignore. In February 1943, American factories produced 1,500 new tanks. The entire German production for the same month was 320 tanks, most of which were needed on the Eastern Front. The Afrika Korps received fewer than 50 replacement tanks during this period, while losing over 150. Rommel's aide, Lieutenant Alfred Berndt, recalled a revealing moment. "We captured an American supply depot with cases of new boots, chocolate, cigarettes, and canned food. The field marshal picked up a can and stared at it silently. For our men," he finally said, "such items are Christmas presents. For the Americans, they are daily rations." I had never seen him so somber. The psychological impact of material superiority extended beyond mere numbers. American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and supported by an abundance of artillery, air power, and medical services. German troops, increasingly malnourished and lacking basic supplies, could see the contrast firsthand. With each passing week, desertions among Italian troops increased, while even the most dedicated German units struggled with declining morale. Captain Ludwig Hoffmann of the 15th Panzer Division described the deteriorating conditions. "My men haven't had a proper meal in 2 weeks. Their uniforms are falling apart, and half the company has dysentery. Then we capture an American position and find fresh bread, canned meat, chocolate bars, and medical supplies. How do you maintain fighting spirit when the enemy eats better than your own officers? Some of my men weep at the sight of American rations." By contrast, Staff Sergeant Bill Crawford of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division described the American logistics system. "We had hot meals delivered to the front lines whenever possible. Our quartermasters would apologize if we had to eat K rations for more than 2 days in a row. Each of us got a carton of cigarettes per week, chocolate bars, coffee. Things we took for granted, but that amazed the German POWs. One captured officer asked me if I was from a wealthy family when he saw my equipment. I told him I was a factory worker from Detroit before the war, and he just shook his head in disbelief." As the Allied forces regrouped after Kasserine Pass, General Dwight D. Eisenhower removed Fredendall and placed General George Patton in command of 2 corps. This leadership change, combined with the lessons learned from initial combat, transformed the American forces. Rommel, who had dismissed these troops as soft Italians with better equipment, now faced opponents who were rapidly gaining combat experience while maintaining their material advantage. Rommel's health was deteriorating as well, plagued by chronic sinus problems and exhaustion. On March 9, 1943, he left Africa for the last time, turning command over to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The official reason was medical leave, but Rommel knew that the North African campaign was lost. His personal pilot, Captain Heinrich Seibel, later revealed, "As our plane lifted off from Tunisian soil, the field marshal looked out at the desert below and said quietly, 'We never had a chance against their factories.'" The statistics tell the stark story of what happened in those 5 months between October 1942 and March 1943. When Operation Torch landed American forces in North Africa, the Afrika Korps possessed approximately 675 operational tanks. By the time Rommel departed, fewer than 150 remained. American and British forces had destroyed or captured over 500 German tanks, a loss rate that German industry could never hope to replace. Even more telling was the impact on the broader war effort. The resources Germany poured into the doomed North African campaign, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and irreplaceable veteran troops, were desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where the titanic struggle against the Soviet Union hung in the balance. Colonel Hans von Luck, who served under Rommel in Africa, later wrote, "We were not defeated by superior tactics, but by superior production." The Americans learned warfare quickly, but more importantly, they had the industrial capacity to sustain massive losses while we had to preserve every tank, every aircraft. By 1943, we were fighting not just armies but economies, and Germany's economy could not match America's. The American approach to tank design itself reflected this industrial mindset. While German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were engineering masterpieces with superior armor and firepower, they were complex, expensive, and difficult to maintain. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for mass production and ease of maintenance. Its parts were standardized, its systems simplified, and its design optimized for railway transport and shipping. It might have been inferior to German tanks in a one-on-one engagement, but the Americans could field 5 Shermans for every German Panzer IV and 15 for every Tiger. Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Hauser of German Army Intelligence compiled a report in April 1943 that highlighted this fundamental difference in approach. The Americans build adequate tanks in tremendous numbers. We build superior tanks in inadequate numbers. The mathematics of war favor them overwhelmingly. Their Sherman tank is powered by an aircraft engine that they already produce in the thousands. Our tanks require specialized engines built in limited quantities. This disparity in production philosophy permeates every aspect of our respective war efforts. The aftermath was swift and decisive. On May 13, 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 German and Italian troops were captured, a loss comparable to Stalingrad. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked on the Eastern Front, was shattered completely in the deserts of Tunisia. For Rommel, the lesson was bitter but clear. In a letter to his wife dated April 1943, he wrote, "The war is lost. America's entry has decided it. Their industrial might is overwhelming. What I would give for just 1 month of their production capacity." The transformation in Rommel's assessment of American fighting capability was complete. These soft Italians with better equipment had proven to be quick learners in combat, and backed by an industrial machine that could replace every loss many times over. His dismissive comment, made in the confidence of victory, had been thoroughly disproven by the reality of American production and adaptability. Major General Omar Bradley, who would later command American forces in Europe, summarized the North African campaign's significance. "In Tunisia, we learned to fight. The Germans learned they could lose." The implications extended far beyond North Africa. German high command now understood that American industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm them on every front. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, German defenders faced not only experienced American troops, but a seemingly endless supply of equipment. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the production disparity had grown even wider. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, admitted after the war, "The war was won by American industry long before the first American soldier set foot on continental soil. Once your tanks and planes began arriving in Britain and Russia in 1942, our defeat was mathematically certain. We had absolutely no chance to overcome such tremendous production capacity." The numbers support this assessment. In 1944, at the peak of its war production, Germany manufactured approximately 19,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In the same year, America produced 29,497 tanks, while also building 96,318 aircraft to Germany's 40,593. The United States accomplished this despite fighting a two-front war against both Germany and Japan, with American industry supplying not only its own forces, but also those of Britain and the Soviet Union through the extensive Lend-Lease program. For soldiers on the ground, the reality was even more stark. Lieutenant Hans Baumann of the 21st Panzer Division described the final weeks in Tunisia. "We were counting individual artillery shells, limiting ourselves to firing only when absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, the Americans conducted artillery barrages that lasted for hours, expending more ammunition in a single day than we had for a month. Their planes seemed to be everywhere, while we hadn't seen a Luftwaffe aircraft in weeks. It wasn't a battle anymore, but a slow execution." The experience of Corporal Michael Weber of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division was typical. "My tank was hit by American artillery near Meta. The damage was reparable, a thrown track and damaged road wheels. But we had no spare parts. So we stripped it for anything useful and abandoned it. The Americans would have had it back in action within hours. For us, each lost vehicle was lost forever." The experience of Corporal Michael Weber of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division was typical. "My tank was hit by American artillery near Meta. The damage was reparable, a thrown track and damaged road wheels. But we had no spare parts. so we stripped it for anything useful and abandoned it. The Americans would have had it back in action within hours. For us, each lost vehicle was lost forever. Captain Richard Winters, an American paratrooper who would later gain fame in Normandy, trained with officers who served in North Africa. He recalled their assessment. They told us that the Germans were excellent tacticians, brave soldiers, but increasingly fatalistic. They knew they couldn't match our production capacity. One captured German officer had told my friend, "For every tank we destroy, you build 3 more. How do you expect us to win such a war?" The answer, of course, was that Germany couldn't win such a war. By underestimating American industrial capacity and the adaptability of American troops, Rommel and the German High Command had made a fatal strategic error. The dismissive comment about soft Italians with better equipment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare's industrial nature. Wehrmacht records reveal the extent of the miscalculation. In planning for the North African campaign, German logistics officers had calculated supply needs based on typical combat loss rates experienced against British forces. They had not accounted for facing an opponent who could replace losses almost immediately and who had seemingly unlimited ammunition and fuel reserves. Colonel Rudolf Siekenius, who commanded the 10th Panzer Division during its final battles in Tunisia, wrote in his last report, "We are fighting with the knowledge that each vehicle lost is irreplaceable, while the Americans abandon damaged tanks because replacement is easier than repair. This creates a different psychological approach to battle. They can afford risks we cannot contemplate." The industrial disparity translated directly into battlefield realities. American artillery fired approximately 200,000 shells during the battle for the Kasserine Pass. The entire monthly allocation for Axis forces in North Africa was 60,000 shells spread across all calibers. American P-47 fighter bombers carried heavier bomb loads than German Stuka dive bombers, flew faster, and operated with impunity as German air power dwindled. By April 1943, the once proud Afrika Korps was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages meant tanks had to be dug in as static pillboxes rather than used in the mobile warfare at which German forces excelled. Ammunition was so scarce that gun crews were often limited to just 3 shells per day for training. American forces conducted live-fire exercises with abundant ammunition, allowing their green troops to gain proficiency rapidly. Private First Class Robert Johnson of the 1st Armored Division described encountering German positions during the final offensive. They had dug in their tanks as bunkers because they had no fuel to move them. Their soldiers were thin, many were sick, and they surrendered in large groups once they realized how completely hopeless their position was. One German tank commander told me through an interpreter that they had been on quarter rations for many weeks. When I shared my K-rations with him, he almost cried with gratitude. These weren't the supermen we had been warned about. The final surrender in Tunisia marked the end of Germany's North African ambitions and secured the Mediterranean for Allied shipping. More importantly, it demonstrated to both sides a truth that would define the remainder of the war: American industrial might, combined with rapidly improving tactical proficiency, represented an insurmountable advantage. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who oversaw the Mediterranean theater, summarized the lesson. "We could win battles, even campaigns, but we could not overcome America's factories. Each German soldier had to be a perfectionist because we could not replace him. Each American soldier was backed by 3 more in reserve and by an industrial complex that made ours look like a cottage industry." For Rommel, who would later be forced to commit suicide after being implicated in the July 1944 plot to kill Hitler, the North African campaign represented a harsh education in the realities of modern war. His initial dismissal of American forces as soft Italians with better equipment had given way to a grim appreciation of how equipment, abundantly supplied, readily replaced, and wielded by experienced troops, could overcome even the most brilliant tactics. The tale of the Afrika Korps' loss of 500 tanks in 5 months stands as one of history's examples of how industrial capacity shapes warfare. Rommel, for all his brilliance, found himself commanding forces with diminishing resources against an opponent whose strength grew with each passing week. No amount of skill could overcome such a fundamental disparity. As American forces advanced across Europe in 1944 and 1945, they did so with confidence born in the deserts of North Africa. They had faced Germany's best and proven that American industry and adaptability were a match for the Wehrmacht. Rommel's dismissive comment had been answered not with words, but with the overwhelming evidence of American power. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.